So let's open up the discussion. Before that, I'd just like to make sort of a few remarks to the speakers, but they're also addressed to the other members of the audience that I think can contribute much to this discussion. So thank you all for three brilliant, fascinating papers that really sort of were a very appropriate ending for this day. And they interact with one another in very interesting ways. And so the first set of questions, again, for Professor Diwan and also for the audience, is about this whole issue of generation. So my question to you would be sort of more conceptual. So, you know, there are various theoreticians of generation from Karl Mannheim onwards. But if we think historically, you know, in the interwar period, people spoke about the Effendi as the new generation. In the 1950s, people spoke about, you know, the generation of Nasser and Abdel Karim Qasim as the new generation. My colleague Yoav De Capua showed that it's more a matter of a decade. You know, people talk about Jil al-Khamsinat and Jil al-Sittinat, Jil al-Nakba and Jil al-Naksa. So it's become, so is it a generation, or is it almost like a trope in a revolutionary moment? Or to bring Professor Cooke's talk, are we talking about something that is more Ibn Khaldunian, more circular? Because again, historically, if we look at works by Nelida Fukara or Toby Matthews and so on, you see, you know, that there were in the Gulf, there was a Nasserist moment, a laborist movement, even communists, the civil war in Yemen. The other question that I had is, you talk a lot about very diverse countries and diverse groups. So, and some of the goals have to do with sect, and some of the goals have to do with gender, and some of the goals have to do with Islam. So I liked very much how you use the concept of youth and generation to do what Professor Khanna suggested earlier, to break this kind of all dichotomies between tribe and city and man and women. But can we talk about them as one group, as their that is sort of determined generationally, thinking that their goals are so different, and thinking also that, you know, sectarian politics in place like Oman is very different than sectarian politics in place like Saudi Arabia. And finally, I was wondering how do these groups, or how do you as the scholar define and again, this is open to discussion, define the limits of success? So what would be considered in this kind of for certain groups as success? I mean, I can see, you know, women's driving is sort of a goal where people sort of potentially think about it as successful, but with the more radical goals, I'm not entirely certain. So this again is something that we can talk about. Again, Professor Laurie's fascinating paper encouraged us to think about, you know, things that Robert Vitalis and others have written about, this kind of connection between policing, race, ethnicity, and globality. And here, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the groups themselves rather than their policing. So obviously, you mentioned something extremely interesting about how the Bangladeshis are perceived as more dangerous than others. But how do the different other groups, you know, from the Philippines, from Afghanistan, from India, from Nepal, how are they perceived? And also whether policing benefits from tensions between these different populations. So it has, you know, in the United States, for example, there are tensions between Hispanic communities and African American communities. And I mean, you used so interestingly sort of the difference between the settled and unsettled to think about security. But here I'm wondering also how it plays out spatially. If we think about the security needs of the state, then, you know, women who work in houses, people who work in hotel, drivers who drive taxis. So I guess the challenges of the police also have to be conceptualized somehow, especially in relationship to where these people work. And then again, tying it with the talk of Professor Cooke, I was thinking about a work that is produced here by Dina Rashid, who's a graduate student who works with Lisa Wedin on the Egyptian police. and how sort of the police that you're describing is in some ways more similar to the British police, as they wanted to suggest in some context, than to the Egyptian police. So I wonder if that actually makes this kind of endeavor much more modern and much more global than we wanted to think, although sort of the speakers here kind of talk about unique Emirates desires. And then thinking again about an American context, I'm wondering if there's any competition just out of lack of knowledge. So is there also private powers that work for particular companies serve in the service of American and Europeans? And finally, for Professor Cooke, again, there's so many questions here, but your evocation of Ibn Khaldun is quite interesting, and I'm thinking about how we think about nasab in this context. And you mentioned this very fascinating idea of pure blood, but I was wondering in sort of everyday economy or sort of the everyday practices where appointments and you know, work and promotion are also determined by somebody's family, then it, in some ways, although you brought the Kamarov's quote, but in some ways it also kind of contradicts this kind of neoliberal idea that, you know, you're promoted based on merit and success. And I guess that European companies that work with certain Qataris might evoke this kind of logic. So I wonder how nasab kind of work within the economy. And then, and here, whether perhaps there's some contradiction between the tribal and the modern. And then, again, thinking about, you know, works like Joseph Mas'ad's, he shows that tribes, at least in Jordan, where, you know, both objects of kind of imagined authenticity, but also objects of reform. So there's also an idea that you need to reform something about them. So in your context, I'm wondering again, when you kind of think about this tribal modern, how else can we think about it? Is it an invented tradition? Obviously, there are strong elements of performativity here, you know, the camel races, the markets. When we talk about this kind of imagined community, when does it past begin? I mean, we talk about millennias, we talk about the rise of Islam, we talk about the 12th century, we talk about folks going to their grandparents. So it's a kind of very amorphous past, but also very fascinating. So again, thank you for really a brilliant panel, and I look forward to your answers and the discussion following it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your comments and challenging questions. I think it's pretty clear. I've done a lot of work, and I have assembled a lot of sort of descriptive and interesting empirical material. I think there's probably a lot more work I can do on the conceptual side. I guess I'll just tell you sort of, I'm working kind of from two sides, and they're not completely fully working together, I think, at this point. But I'll just tell you what I'm thinking right now, and then people can throw in stuff and help me out, maybe. One thing you talked about on the level of generation, I am playing with the idea of generation just to kind of try to think about what makes this different, because I don't, you know, obviously if you look at any revolutionary moment, youth are going to be a big part of that. I mean, that's just, you know, anywhere in history, I think youth are, that's, you know, the nature sort of youth and the lack of commitment and tolerance of risk, and there's a lot of reasons why you would expect to see youth in any sort of revolutionary coalition. But I think at the same time that I don't think that all generations are the same. So it's not like you talk about generation 10 years ago and then this is a generation here. I think there is something going on that is leading to a kind of a recognizable transition that we can see actual political effects of that. So, and I tend to think that it really is linked to the new information environment. I think that's really critical in the Gulf, that it's really changed a lot of the dynamics. And I think the information environment it's both constitutive and instrumental, and I think that's part of the problem that I'm getting at, because the experience of kind of working within this new information environment, and it's both kind of the revolution that happened with Al Jazeera and with television, but it's also the revolution that happened then in social media as well, means that the interaction between people, the kind of openness of information and of different viewpoints is there, and then also the interaction with people is different, and so that that both kind of constitutes a new sort of ethos amongst this generation, and it's incomplete. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that everybody is like this, but there is something that's going on that's different, and I should say that, I mean, this is sort of also, I mean, people have written about this as more of a global phenomenon too. I mean, people have been writing about this for some time. At the same time, if you look at it then in terms of what I'm trying kind of more concretely to look at then is how, though you see youth trying to define themselves kind of emerging as a separate political category. And this, I think, is really related to what you talked about what the goal is. And I think that's sort of part of what the goal is to be looking at themselves within a certain political environment where the political actors are quite laid out, and everyone knows sort of what the interaction is between sort of the ruling family and the governments and the way that they work within different groups. And the idea that things really seriously need to change, and that's related to the economic challenges that I spoke about, in the sense that there's just a lot more that can happen in these societies beyond what is happening, that things are just a bit too static. But to do that means sort of challenging the existing political situation as it's set up. Which means that, where the governments use these different intermediary groups. And so I think what we can see then is that both kind of the different consciousness that emerged through that, and then also the instrument of having the social media actually allowed for kind of the communication and the creation of sort of new movements. And you can see this from, I mean, if you go back and see where you start to see this emerging, it's always around things like the chat rooms that you had in Oman and in Bahrain, and then later, instances where maybe you were able to get around the kind of borders that, it wasn't easy to go beyond sort of the recruitment systems of like tribe and Islamic movements and these sorts of things. And the new technology allowed for that sort of communication, a different kind of communication that allowed for the emergence then of a new youth movement. And I think that it's very incomplete. It's very contingent, obviously, too. I mean, so the question is, you could see this happening prior to the Arab Spring. It was already taking place. I mean, one of the big questions for me is now, I mean, that, the governments have kind of recognized this, and the other movements, by the way, have recognized this, youth movement, I mean, Islamic movements and the like, and are trying to put sort of new restrictions on that. What is that going to mean for these new formations? Because the political space is not going to be there in the way that it was there before. So,
Yes, thank you.
Well, lots of really thoughtful questions. So on the question of how did the groups themselves fare, and I think definitely this is something that needs more research on my part, because all of my interviews were with the police side. And that was because the interviews were actually about something related, which is a dissertation, but the manuscript as it stands is actually it takes a much more kind of top-down understanding of security than what now kind of pulling some threads out of the work and thinking about. So this isn't really, I think that it would require, to actually turn this into a paper, I would need to go in and see how the people living in the communities with those police talk about the police themselves. I'm really interested in thinking about citizenship from the perspective of not how do we talk, not the decrees and the nationalism, but really the papers. Like, who gets them? How do you get them? How do you register? And that, for me, that's where the oil politics comes in, because we often, when we're talking about redistribution, we often talk about how the money changes political consciousness. So we understand sort of these citizens or Gulf citizens as not being, not demanding rights because of the money, as opposed to thinking about a system where, well, if 96% of your labor force is deportable, then it changes how oil impacts. But if you look at how identity ID cards, like the national ID system, is set up, you see that the lens of the security is not just by national origin; it's also extremely by occupation. Okay. So there's different strategies for different parts of the labor force, and it depends on whether you could be Indian elite versus Indian in the construction labor camps. You're a totally different person to the security forces. So when you look at the way the people were registered, it was first nationals and then white-collar workers, which is often coded as white people in these elite or sort of, elite institutions, especially financial institutions. And then it breaks down to service workers, service industry workers, and then construction workers, and finally like domestic workers. That's the way to register the population. So that's also geographical, but it's much more occupation than geography. And of course, national origin is coded in there. You can see concentrations of groups. I have to talk to Dina then, because it sounds like I really do think that this is a comparative, that this is not something that is exceptional to the Gulf. I think that the policies in British India in particular are interesting, the way they diffuse to Cyprus, to Israel, to other cases. There's someone at Harvard right now, Yael Berda, who's a colleague of my postdoc, and I find
the
our
Palestinian
work is very,
police,
very compatible and similar things. I'll stop there because I don't want to take too much.
Thank you.
I don't have much to say. I appreciate the questions. So the question of nasab or lineage, I think it does pertain within the native population, and the meritocracy probably happens differently among the Gastarbeiter. In terms of invented tradition, I guess I didn't do a very good job here making the absolute distinction, but for me, I look at Hobsbawm and Range's work, obviously, and use it to say that it's not invented traditions, because it's something that has so much, it's so body oriented, that it's much less than the way I understand their notion of invented tradition. So I feel it's much more embodied.
Okay, thank you. So let's open it up for questions. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor. Thank you very much. Ask some comment about the relationship between technologies and so on with capital accumulation. Like that term you said, that it's in the interest, I guess, of local and the whole country, sort of states and so on, to where just go. So do you have a connection between, or maybe you haven't already something about the connection between this Same question is, you suggested this video, the veiled policing, is kind of a hard space in which family relationships can be rethought and created. And that's a lot of it. Likewise, really interesting paper. The other examples were Gulf people. Exceptional to that. I was very fascinated. Actually, I don't know if you comment on the process by which he takes this image of the flower and says, well, this is I found that that's actually a very class or a certain demographic that you go,
As pre-modern.
that's pretty much, I talked to management sort of students, and they were not so into this tribal thing. They were, they were coming from, often from like Iranian backgrounds.
Ooh,
Like, they
There's
were,
your
they were
answer.
Ajam, they call them Ajam, or they were coming from like, they were originally Palestinian, for example. They're not like Adawi as Arabic. So I don't know if this question, this comment, I was really interested in that example of how that the sort of contradictions and the diversity and interpretations of what is traditional and how it gets materialized.
Really thoughtful comments. So on the wages in that publication in particular, it was all about not actually hiring irregular domestic workers. So making sure that you go through specific agencies and that these are the minimum wage levels. And in that sense, I think that the police is highly involved in maintaining this wage structure, but always from the perspective of kind of technocratic language of administrative management. Also, in fairness, I think that, as someone who's really interested in the way that, in the consistent structural sort of abuse and of workers that happens, what becomes really challenging from the perspective of enforcing things like minimum wage levels, or you deal with people who have contracts that they sign in the sending country, they come to the receiving country, it's a different contract, it's in Arabic, et cetera, is that much of the debt starts accruing from before people have even come in. So it's recruitment agencies and then sub-recruiters and sub-recruiters, and everyone's taking a cut. So even if from the Qatari side or the UAE side, the sponsor is paying, you end up with people actually being in debt before coming in. So I think that they're involved in that maintenance, but don't necessarily have this kind of, well, I guess also understanding that security is about keeping people also in separate spheres. And when I kept pushing, like, why is this the way to register people? Why not do it by district? Why are you doing it by like white collar workers? And it was so naturalized that they were like, well, obviously it has to be that way. Like, you can't have a CEO next to a maid. And it's like, why not? But their sense of like keeping things in place is about regulating these different groups differently. The expatriate, the white collar expatriate, has to have a different experience. It has to be manicured in a particular way. And some of it is language training. So they have people who speak Tagalog or different languages based on who's registering. So part of it is, it makes sense to break it down in that way. But again, it's not a national origin breakdown, it's an occupation breakdown. So you can see how the two kind of intermix. So on that question of class, I think it's highly intertwined and in subtle everyday ways. And then the second question, which I know was, family relations being debated. I think that certainly the role of the woman is being really debated across the Gulf, but at least, and this is on a more personal note, I've noticed that it's always on kind of safe topics. So education is safe. Certain jobs are safe. You want to have a conversation about how do we put gang rape victims in jail with their oppressors? No, you cannot talk about this as a red line. And I felt that blowback, including from other sort of feminists, professors who are Emirati or Bahraini, who are like, this is not your work. Why are you even talking about this? Like this, there are certain red lines. So I think that what the police are trying to do there is like kind of push one of the occupations that is not necessarily the one that's kind of seen as this is the proper occupation for an Emirati woman. But I do agree that this is a broader debate, the family relations, and in general, it's not just an open debate. There are certain safe topics that, and when it comes to education, you actually see women are outnumbering men when it comes to the Gulf. So that's not our main issue. You want to talk about inheritance, you want to talk about rape, some of these other things, then that's where you really feel the blowback on that issue.
Thank you. I will respond, if I may, with Nouvel's words. So he has this long thing about the National Museum and the Desert Rose. But then later he says, a nomadic people builds its capital city and talks about it through this emblematic monument built with the most contemporary construction tools, steel, glass, and fiery concrete, and will communicate through high-definition cinema, because there are no objects, and this actually was an answer to an earlier question. There were no objects from the past, because as a nomadic people, they just had enough to carry with them, or so that's what they discovered, that, oh my God, we have no objects. So what we will do is we will turn the walls into cinema skin and have just the oral history. And we'll communicate through high-definition cinema, incorporating visitors' movements into its museography. This museum is a modern-day caravanserai. From there, you leave the desert and you return from it, bringing back treasured images that remain forever engraved on your memory. This is more than just a metaphor. The National Museum of Qatar will become Qatar's voice of culture, delivering a message about the metamorphosis of modernity and the beauty that happens when the desert meets the sea. So it isn't just we're playing back to you your tribal past. It's all about braiding the two together.
Yeah, Carl, yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about demography, specifically the charts with rapid,
Yeah.
and it's almost entirely 100%. I'm worried about this change in demography and attitudes within both countries, experience this among government officials and among society about sustainability of this, of their society. Specifically, are there, I mean, does it become a function of security? So you can manage all these people, the workers in the desert, and make sure all the finance people are safe in the condos and whatnot. Is it a matter of creating political opportunities for political engagement, or ideally?
You know what? Let's collect a few questions and then we'll let you answer. So, Laurie, I saw Richard. Okay, so let's just go by order of seating.
My question is for Noora. From what I recollect, what I've heard about the UAE, I remember once reading an article about being mercenaries. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
You've heard of it. So I'm wondering, did that come up at all? And then also the fact that when I was there, I often felt people were discussing that a lot of the police force is actually made up of non-Emiratis. So I'm wondering how that might factor into your research.
Okay, Richard.
I just was going to say that it'll be a good use you'd like us to bring up Foucault. All three of your panels, Foucault, in some respect, I mean that's a compliment, sincerely. And my question was for Professor Laurie also, this sort of panoptic apparatus, is it focused at all on the Emiratis themselves, or is it used almost exclusively for surveilling the migrants?
Okay, so from Foucault now to Jean-François. Foucault to Jean.
Two questions that are somewhat related. Police policies in Bahrain are very confrontational, and the vast majority of the police is Baluch in Bahrain, and it's really meant to act against the Shia community, not against the foreign community. So is that the same way with the UAE, or UAE citizens, and even we don't know whether they are mostly UAE citizens doing the police work. Does that mean it works better? That's why it works better in the UAE and why it works so better. On the Qatari thing, I just love your presentation. It's great, the poetry is beautiful. But this whole Bedouin thing is a myth. Totally, and in my view, and I'm sure you don't agree with that, but what I'd like to know from you, if you have any figures actually, on how many Qataris there are that are really Qatari. You mentioned the blood issue, but I know many Qataris that are actually born in India, who became Qataris by fiat of the Emir. You know, maybe not in the last 20 years or so, but before that. And their family had families and married and so on, but they have nothing to do with the Bedouins. And this whole, and we see that Bedouin thing also in Saudi Arabia, actually. Ultimately, the vast majority of the Saudis are not Bedouins, even though they like to think that. So I'm just wondering if there are any figures on this. That's really my question.
Sylvia? Sean, yeah.
Thank you very much for your very kind comments. But second, one of the things I've seen in other artistic movements is that people are talking to each other, even though it's not square. How much have you seen of these different movements called, say, Shia and other people are communicating with each other, and what does that mean for the future of the region?
Okay. Noora, why don't we start with you, because I think you have sort of the...
I worry that I would take up all the time. I want to give that. Should I let the others speak? Or should I?
Okay, so let's start with Kristin, and then
Sure.
And then I'll do all of them at once.
Okay, and then we'll go to Miriam, and then we'll return to you at the end. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, they talk with each other a lot, and that's part of what that's part of the whole process, right, of creating it as a sense of a movement as itself, is the ability to kind of come together and to communicate. And that's, again, where social media has been really important, to bring people who are perhaps like-minded that wouldn't have come across each other from different groups, you know, and to find each other in this kind of community of Twitter or Facebook, mostly Twitter, actually. But what's interesting is to try to go beyond that is dependent on the ability to actually do that, to get together. And there were some attempts to do this. So there was one group I looked at a lot, and actually it's linked back to the story of the Muslim Brotherhood somehow tangentially in Qatar, because in Qatar the Muslim Brotherhood, as we know, dissolved itself voluntarily. It's the only Muslim Brotherhood movement in the world to ever do this. And we can talk about whether that was sort of this agreement, de facto agreement with the government. But the leader, the Murshid, actually, part of it was through his real dissatisfaction with the Brotherhood based on some of these substantive issues about how the Brotherhood was running sort of a circular organization to reproduce itself. They weren't really doing anything. There wasn't an orientation where people were able to actually look at Islamic texts and to think about them anymore. So he stopped and reflected and started a new movement called the Nahda movement, which was based on a lot of these sort of values that I'm talking about. I mean, like the people who would come and do the program, when you don't have to join or anything, you just come and do the program. And once you do the program, you're able to do some interpretation of yourself, of thinking about what you think about, you know, the Islamic text, whatever you're engaging with. And then very importantly, at the end of it, you're supposed to come up with a project. So again, it's very like action oriented. We're gonna actually do something, and it's something that I've decided myself that I'm going to do. And everybody does that. And so he was bringing people into Qatar to do this program, actually, and it was quite influential in Saudi Arabia. And just quickly, I'll get down that. Okay, I'll make it shorter. And you had basically then these people who graduated from that movement then deciding to create another program of sort of discussion groups. And they were bringing together Gulfis from across all of the different Gulf countries and trying to have these meetings. And they were able to do that 2 times, but the third time when they were supposed to meet in 2012, the meeting was actually broken up. And it was basically interesting because it wasn't just about governments as well, it was also about competitor movements and Salafi movements who saw this new organization of youth movement that were gathering across Gulf countries as a threat and tried to work against it. So again, there's a lot of attempts both to communicate but then to actually come together, but that became restricted by governments and harassed by other movements who were protecting their space politically.
Miriam?
Yes, so I totally agree that the Qataris, of course, were not originally all Bedou, because, of course, for millennia there has been the pearl trade. So the Bedou and Badawa and Hadara have existed for probably as long as we can go back. But what I'm talking about is, I don't want to call it invention of tribe, but because it sounds too close to the invention of tradition, but let's call it invention anyhow, because I showed how that worked with the Al-Thanis. But I have another example that I think might be quite vivid. And that was when I first went to Doha and was talking with a friend, Amira Sumbul, about my idea of the tribal modern, and I thought it was maybe kind of crazy, and she goes, "No, I think you should try it out on my class." So she teaches at Georgetown in Qatar. So I came up with this term, and the students, no, this is really great. This is exactly what's happening here. And then one of the students asked me if I had transport back to the hotel, and I said no, I could get it. And he said, "I'd like to take you." I said, okay. And he gets into the car and he says, "Well, I really enjoyed meeting you, but we then moved on to something." And he said, "My grandfather must be turning in his grave because I'm here and I'm driving this kind of a car." His grandfather was Gamal Abdel Nasser. But he said, what I have learned, justifying his being there, what I have learned is, in fact, we are not from Falah roots. We're actually from the Al-Murra. So now we have the second president of Free Egypt, who is actually connected to the Al-Murra, those guys who are fighting on the borders between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And that's the way it works, because, you suddenly, well, yes, I think I'm connected, and then suddenly you've constructed either, it's better to construct a Bedou heritage, lineage, nasab, because it might take you back to the Hijaz.
Okay.
Thank you. So lots of great questions. I really appreciate all of them. The first question, demography and security. I think I should note that sometimes when I put that chart, I lead to this conclusion, but I don't want to depict it as though there was like a state of zero, where there was an empty space where the very homogeneous Arab society, and then everyone comes after, because what happens with the formation of citizenship laws is we see people actively being narrated out. Certain Ajmis, and you have different conceptions of who's a citizen based on which emirate. So actually the book manuscript really is about the kind of different conceptions between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Dubai had a much more expansive notion of citizenship and actually gave passports to people. Abu Dhabi didn't consider these people citizens and actually required Iranians to have a visa. Now if you see who's going to go from Bandar Linja all the way to Tehran to get a visa and come back down to the south. So of course you had lots of actually populations who don't get counted in the census as citizens, but are definitely part of the community. And then there's a huge Indian community that doesn't get counted as citizens, and they've been there for, now 4th generations, even longer in some cases, because they were always under the British. And this kind of relates to your question about the court system, and the court system is an inheritance of that time. So you had 2 different court systems, and foreigners were regulated by the British courts, and that goes to the Ministry of Interior. So now foreigners are regulated by the Ministry of Interior. They can still, you have labor rights on the books, of course, and you can still go to the courts. The problem is the ministry, you can take a case against a sponsor, he can cancel your visa through the Ministry of Interior before it even gets to the courts. So what it ends up being is that even if initially there was a much more different relationship between the courts and the Ministry of Interior, as this migrant population expands, you see the Ministry of Interior's power also expands vis-a-vis the court system, and it makes it much harder to regulate against things like surveillance and security, because these are national security issues. Which brings me to this question of what is specifically the threat about this new demographic change. You can see, and I think this relates to a lot of your comments, a lot of fear about Arab nationalism, ideas about especially Egyptians and Yemenis coming in, and you can look in the British records, and they're counting, like there are already 15 Egyptians in Abu Dhabi against our better judgment and our advice to the sheikh. He's letting them in. Like, these guys are troublemakers. So you see an active move, especially from the 90s onwards, towards labor that is considered quote unquote safer. So in this case, it's not, in much of immigration debate, it's like the cultural distance creates a threat, whereas here it's like the cultural affinity is what potentially creates the threat of insurrection, and that's why we're scared of other Arab migrants. And there's a whole sphere of around Dubai, and the Dubai police forces were established way before Abu Dhabi, and they were much more kind of engaged with this question. So you have very early on kind of studies about this entire sphere of what's called family social security. They're really concerned with juvenile delinquency and sort of what impact does heterogeneity in your society lead to among youth? Are they more likely to be exposed to ideas that are not organic, quote unquote, to us, like homosexuality? The police were very concerned about these kinds of, so there's different dimensions of why this demographic change is seen as a security threat. The question of mercenaries, I'm glad you brought that because it relates to your question about who are the people who are driving this. There's an entire marketplace, and if you go to any security expositions in Abu Dhabi, you will see it's like a Disneyland for all of the big security companies from around the world. Russia, France, Italy, they're all selling different technologies. They're all trying to get these big contracts. They're very unself-conscious about it. One of my favorite was like this American company had a rolling stage, and the guy was in the middle, and he was kind of like giving this big presentation. He was like, "Do you have problems with online mobilization? Are you worried about the Arab Spring coming? We have the technology for you." And it's kind of fascinating how unself-conscious people are. And if you go to Abu Dhabi and you meet, you live there and you meet a lot of the expats, they're almost all kind of connected to some security company or another. So this is definitely, there's a big foreign presence. When I was doing my interviews, I remember with one of the strategic directors who implemented these changes, as he was talking to me, in the period of 3 hours, he had 7 different receipts. I kept seeing what he was signing, and there were receipts from consulting companies, from McKinsey to Booth to all of them. So this is a huge industry. On the question of whether the rank and file of the police are, and this relates to your question, where are they from? Abu Dhabi and Dubai police are considered very prestigious posts, and so people kind of fight to try to get into those police forces. When you see in Ras Al Khaimah and some of these other areas, that's where you see more mercenaries, and that's all. And that's also because. Guess who funds the police in those areas? It's not those emirates. The funding for the the coercive apparatus comes from Abu Dhabi. So from the beginning, this was, when you talk about kind of monopoly over violence, their independence is very tangential, right? And Bahrain is an interesting case. I was talking to Insang Ho about this, but I don't know why Baluchis keep coming up in all of my research in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and generations back with the Omani Empire into East Africa. Baluchis are constantly like mercenaries. Now they're security guards. I know them well in Bahrain. And you're absolutely right. The Shia cannot be in the security, this will be again edited out, I hope, in the Ministry of Interior, not in the police force, not in the military, and it's all Pakistanis, Baluchis, other Sunni Arabs that have been naturalized. So the UAE has tightened, and there are populations that it could easily absorb and increase its national population, but chooses to define citizenship very, very restrictively. Whereas Bahrain, because of its kind of declining oil and sort of desire to change the percentage of Sunnis to Shia, has actively naturalized a lot of people who enter into the security forces from Jordan, from Egypt, etc. And I think that, implementation in law, I think I got.
Yeah, I think it was, brilliant. Okay, so thank you all for your patience, and thanks again for a fascinating panel. And thank again, Richard and Lauren, for a great conference, and thank you all for being here.